Hello, and welcome to another episode of Earth911's Sustainability in Your Ear. This is the podcast conversation about accelerating the transition to a sustainable carbon-neutral society. And I'm your host, Mitch Ratcliffe. Thank you for joining the show. We've talked with many guests about carbon capture strategies, which include natural options like planting trees and restoring prairies and wetlands, pulling CO2 from the atmosphere, which is known as direct air capture, and various technical approaches that engineer changes in the environment or rely on injecting CO2 into deep geological structures to store it for the long term. The industry will be big and diverse, in which many carbon capture companies will coexist to reach a scale necessary to remove trillions of tons of anthropogenic CO2, all the CO2 that we put into the atmosphere since the beginning of the industrial era. But will the industry be a good neighbor to the human communities and natural world? That's the question we're going to address today with Nikki Batchelor, director of the $100 million X-Prize Carbon Removal Program, and Elena Chunny, who is managing advisor at Carbon 180, a non-governmental organization working to reduce and reverse the impact of carbon emissions. The X-Prize, which is funded by the Musk Foundation, awarded 15 $1 million interim prizes during 2022 to the most promising entrants on a path to discover a viable carbon capture business that can remove at least 1,000 tons of CO2 per year. The remainder of the prize will be presented by Earth Day 2025. And following the first round of prizes, the X-Prize team and Carbon 180 conducted a survey of the entrants to understand their commitment to environmental justice. In February, they released a report, From the Ground Up, Recommendations for Building an Environmentally Just Carbon Removal Industry. And it summarizes their findings and presents recommendations about how the nascent industry should engage with the communities where they operate. Nikki and Elena were the lead authors of the report and joined me to discuss environmental justice, community involvement, and how to achieve an equitable carbon capture industry. You can learn more about the X-Prize for carbon removal at www.xprize.org. X-Prize is all one word, no space, no dash. And Carbon 180's mission and work is explained at carbon180.org. Also, no space, no dash, carbon180.org. Welcome to the show, Nikki and Elena. How are you today?
I can't complain. Thank you for having me here today. I'm excited to talk.
That's Elena's voice.
It is. Hi, everyone. For those of you who do not know me, my name is Elena Chunny, and I work with Carbon 180. I guess I'll give a quick rundown of what Carbon 180 does. Okay. Carbon 180 is a nonprofit on a mission to reverse 2 centuries of carbon emissions. And sometimes we refer to it as legacy emissions. So for Carbon 180, we know that climate change can't be fully addressed without removing legacy carbon from the atmosphere. So we work with policymakers, we work with entrepreneurs, we work with peer organizations and environmental justice organizations to design equitable and just policies that will bring necessary carbon removal solutions to gigaton scale.
And Nikki, tell us about the X-Prize before we get started with the conversation.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. I'm Nikki Batchelor. I'm the executive director for the X-Prize Carbon Removal. X-Prize is a nonprofit who uses incentive prize competitions to attack big global challenges in the world. Climate change is at the very top of our list right now. We're doing a lot of work in that space. And the X-Prize Carbon Removal is one of our largest prizes in X-Prize's history, but also one of the largest prizes in history for trying to incentivize solutions in this kind of area.
Now, it's interesting watching the process play out. It's a multi-year process. You've already awarded 15 $1 million prizes to the leading candidates, and you'll award the remaining 85 million over the course of the next 3 years or so, depending on when somebody proves they can do it. As part of this, you're exploring how these companies think about their relationship with their communities, and that's an education process for everyone. Did the survey responses from the companies show that they have an understanding of this question, that they're thinking about environmental equity and social equity in addition to just removing carbon?
I think it most definitely did. I think for the startups who answered the questions, it showed a lot about their willingness to be involved in understanding how to better incorporate equity and justice into the design phases of their project development, and then how to better work with the communities in which they're potentially going to site their projects in.
Intentionality is a surprising thing to see this early in the evolution of an industry. Most of the time, it's just some upstart, which of course is why Milton Friedman would say, don't pay attention to all that other stuff, just focus on profits, right? But today we understand that the costs aren't just reflected in the spreadsheet or in the balance sheet at the end of the day. So do you think that the different companies have different ways of thinking about this, and how do you anticipate helping them come to a shared understanding so that there's some standards for understanding our impact as an industry?
Yeah, absolutely. There are a few things that are probably worth calling out about the cohort itself. So, as far as the number of companies that are registered to compete in the X Prize carbon removal, there are roughly 1,000 registered teams in that competition right now. And the analysis that we undertook last year was specifically looking at the companies who applied for the milestone round of the competition in early 2022. And so that was a cohort of 287 qualified teams, is what we're calling them right now, who really crossed the bar and were in scope for the competition. So the report that we're talking about today really analyzed all of those responses, and those companies represent quite a range of both carbon removal solutions across different kinds of pathways of removing CO2 from the air, or natural solutions from the oceans, et cetera, but also a range of maturity of those companies. So one of the kind of indicators of maturity is something called technology readiness level, or TRL. And that's something that we looked at for the cohort of companies to see, how long have they been around? How far are they in their technology development life cycles? And we saw a range, across 1 to 9. Those are the numbers of TRL on the scale that we use. And you can really see that there's a range of responses reflected in the way that they approach the questionnaire. And so I think we'll probably dig into some of the themes that came out of it, but some of them were more focused on topics such as job creation, whereas others were really thinking about how to approach project siting and engaging with their communities when they first get started, or maybe later in the life cycle. So something we've been trying to do is bring a more holistic perspective to the conversation for all of the companies. So they're not just thinking about environmental justice from one specific lens, but all of the different aspects that it incorporates.
Let's look backward for a moment, because we are dealing with the consequences of an energy industry that has been harmful to indigenous communities, low-income communities, communities of color. Tell us about the kinds of impacts that we're seeking to avoid in the next energy industry. What has happened? What are we trying to prevent?
I think, what we're trying to prevent is disadvantaged communities or low-income Black and Brown communities continuing to have to face the brunt of the environmental injustices. And by injustices, I'm referring to the air pollution, the terrible water quality. And because the carbon removal field is so young, there's an opportunity to avoid some of those past harms. And, in addition to the pollution aspect, there's the component of, hey, we put an industry in a Black and Brown community or a disadvantaged community, but the jobs do not go to them. So how do we make sure that in addition to, having these facilities in these communities, that they're also reaping some of the benefits? And I think that's one of the things that we're trying to solve with the carbon removal field, and with making sure that equity and justice are at the forefront of carbon removal.
Now, the energy industry, in a sense, organized a lot of communities. They put a plant or a production facility somewhere, and then people moved in. And in the process, often created these fence-line communities, the disadvantaged communities that are just right next door and literally bathed in pollution all the time, not being a participant, simply a victim of what's going on next door. How can we avoid creating new fence-line communities like that with carbon capture? And I guess the first question I would ask is, does carbon capture pollute in any of the ways that the oil or gas industry does now? Or are we simply going to avoid that because we're switching to a cleaner way of doing business, for instance?
So I think for starters, when you say carbon capture, are you referring to carbon removal, or are you referring to?
Good question. But let's say, for instance, direct air capture, which is a kind of an industrial facility, right? We're not talking about ocean-based or natural capture, but a technical solution. Are these technical solutions inherently less polluting to begin with? And that seems like a good thing, is it?
I think that there are a range of different potential environmental impacts that go with the different solution areas, and they're going to vary based on what space we're talking about. And so they definitely will not come with zero impact. Our goal is to try and encourage the companies to decrease and lower that impact as much as possible, and also lean into potential co-benefits that the solutions might have in terms of supporting other ecosystem restoration efforts and needs. Some of the ocean solutions do that, some of the natural solutions. I'm not an expert on direct air capture specifically, but I know that there are many different models and approaches to how we're going to explore that. Some are modular, some are large, some are, using renewable energy. Hopefully most of them are using renewable energy. And so I think the hope is that we'll be building like a next generation of industrial plants that are built in a different way from the beginning to, one, address the CO2 problem, but also to have the lowest impact possible. So the hope would be that we're not talking about the same kind of industrial infrastructure that we were previously that had these terrible impacts on the communities. But that doesn't mean that we can't ignore that problem. That's a critical thing to think about when we talk about community engagement and starting to work with local communities. Being honest and open about the risks of the technologies that we're talking about or solutions, as well as the impacts, are one of the key trust building initiatives that we really hope that companies are honest and open about from the beginning.
Yeah, and
please go
I
ahead.
was going to add, and I was going to also say that, in order to avoid what has happened in the past, there is some responsibility to have a regulatory framework in place and have individuals educated to be able to spot when there are, environmental or public health impacts. There are ways that we can redress it so that it's not causing more harm, but we're getting ahead of the problem before the problem gets too big.
Yeah, we basically let the oil and gas industry run away with themselves and with us, took us with them into a very polluting environment. Now, so once a firm has decided to embrace environmental, distributive, and restorative justice, how does that change their decision making?
That's great. So I think it's twofold. You have to think about what that does internally for the startup and externally. Internally, it's looking at things like, what does diversity, equity, and inclusion look like? Who is at the table having these conversations? What is it that we want to get out of this? Of course, profit and making sure that we're meeting, our carbon removal goals is a prime priority. But you have to think about, what does this mean for the community? So then when you're thinking externally, it's like, who do we get involved? What does this public engagement look like? Is it going beyond, just having them come listen to what we have to say and then saying, hey, what feedback do you have in this direct moment? And then it's like, that's it. No, it's actually considering communities as experts in this field and in the design and implementation of the project. It's also making sure that they are aware of what's going on. That transparency is key. So it's putting ownership on industries to say, hey, we know we aren't the best at this. We know that we have our own goals that we want to achieve. However, how can we help you as a community? And what is it that you're looking to gain from our project?
Can you share an example of how a company that you've worked with has made changes to achieve a different outcome? I mean, an example of the dialogue you were just describing, for instance.
Yeah, I'm not sure if it's a different outcome, but I know Carbon 180, we are working very closely with startups and other organizations to make sure that equity and justice are included in, the incorporation of their carbon removal projects. So organizations and companies like Heirloom and Climeworks, they are having these conversations with community members and they're asking them, how can we be of assistance? What do you need to know about this project? And they're saying equity and justice are a priority. It's not just something that they're saying, they're actually living the values. They're involving and having that two-sided communication. And they're like, how can we work to make sure that whatever project we develop benefits not only us, but you as well?
In the United States, business thinks of itself as the primary driver and often puts itself front and center. But business is only half, or I think more accurately, less than half of the stakeholder community that's impacted by any industry. So how do we change that calculus, that just basic set of assumptions about profit first, everything else later? What are the keys to creating an effective community dialogue to even begin to understand how the business can rethink its role in value creation for the world around itself rather than just everything on its balance sheet?
I think the phrase value creation that you just mentioned is really important here, because if we can get collectively as a society to a place where we think about value creation more broadly, and it's not just about the profit of a company, then we're at a much better starting place. And I think that there's been quite a movement over the last decade of companies trying to think about different areas of their business, the impact and the potential opportunities for, having a positive impact on the communities that they work in, and movements like triple bottom line thinking and corporate social responsibility becoming more ingrained in all large companies these days. And we're also seeing the sustainability programs grow and everybody is making their net zero commitments. I think we're seeing that at the larger corporate level, and it's harder to move those mammoths because they're already established, they're bureaucratic. And so the startups, they can see that change of tide and direction for the global economy, but the startups are nimble. They can really take that kind of shifting tide and incorporate it from day one into their company culture, into the positions that they, put on their leadership team, on their boards, and, develop company values and ethics that matter and can be implemented from day one throughout the life cycle of the project. And I think part of that is being very aware of where you're working, the physical place that your company is located, the communities that you're working in. How do you become part of the community so it's not a transactional relationship, and work with them over time as you scale these solutions? What we're talking about here in the carbon removal industry, if it's going to be successful at actually removing significant volumes or gigaton level carbon removal, the projects are going to become very large. And so the startups are small now, but they're going to grow rapidly if this industry really comes to fruition and makes a dent on the climate problem. And so we have to be really thinking into the future with how the companies are built today.
The scale of the industry is really important to point out, because we talk about this as this little startup environment right now. But in order for us to reach that kind of removal capacity, we're talking about 7,000 to 10,000 facilities around the country. Now, back to the idea of community involvement, just for a moment. In the 20th century, the community got the opportunity to speak at a hearing, and then it was pretty much it. And business and the regulators would go do what they were going to do. How should the community actually be involved? Should they have a seat at the table all the time? What's the right way to engage and to truly take seriously the local population's concerns?
I think there needs to be not only, a seat at the table, but there needs to be transparency. And for a lot of what has happened in the 20th century, projects have already had, they've already been cited. They've already been decided on without community buy-in. And I think what needs to happen is there needs to be this shift where we're not getting buy-in after something has been decided. Rather, we are getting the buy-in throughout the whole entire process. So before a project is even, cited, when companies are thinking about, I want to do a direct air capture, where should I put it? Let's start reaching out to communities there. Let's ask them questions. Do you think that this is a great site for direct air capture? And explain to them what is required for that type of facility to thrive. Explain to them that there are both benefits and harms associated with the project. And, you can create that transparency and dialogue throughout the process. And then I think there's also a role for the government to play. The government has set the standards for how public hearings go. We know that. We know that, public hearings are not the easiest. They're not, as easily accessible for communities in which these projects are placed. And that's because they happen during the day and they're at odd times, and people aren't just familiar with how to navigate this space. So part of that ownership needs to go to the government and startups on how to better equip communities to understand the regulatory framework, how to navigate the public hearing process, and how to voice their concerns and opinions in a way that is being heard by everyone.
This is such an important conversation, but I need to take a quick commercial break. We're going to be right back. And we are back to continue talking with Nikki Batchelor of the XPRIZE Carbon Removal Program and Elena Chunny from Carbon 180 about the ethics and social impact of the emerging carbon capture industry. You were talking about the role of government, and the role of government right now is being heavily debated in terms of the establishment of environmental, social, and governance reporting, which is the key to the kind of transparency you were just talking about. And when you spoke a few moments ago about the company talking about both the benefits and the costs, the harms that might be associated with the industry, one of the biggest challenges for industry is talking about the harms. Branding says, we're perfect, trust us. What's the appropriate role for government and regulators in designing this industry? How should they participate? How should they be thinking about helping the companies achieve the social justice we're talking about, or environmental justice we're talking about?
That's a great question. So I will start by saying that some of the most defining innovations of the last century have been pioneered by the public sector. Mm-hmm. The federal government has been a champion with deeper pockets than some, startups or other private industries. And then they have broader expertise. So they have the ability to hire individuals who are trained and skilled to make sure that equity and justice are included in the carbon removal field. So I think it's an absolute must that the government plays a role in the urgency of the climate crisis, in particular in the carbon removal field. And one of the ways in which I'm seeing that is through the direct air capture. A lot of funding has been allocated to direct air capture hub implementation. Part of that funding also went to making sure equity and justice are incorporated in direct air capture implementation, and also making sure community engagement is a big component. The government is actively seeking input from communities on how to best design direct air capture so that it not only benefits them, but it's also solving the climate crisis. And I don't know, Nick, if you want to add anything to that.
Yeah, I agree with everything that you just said. I mean, the DAC hubs that we're seeing playing out in the US is very interesting by the Department of Energy, and the opportunity that the program poses to the space is really around being able to require and ask all of these startup companies and some of the more established companies as well to address this issue front and center. It's a requirement of the proposals. It's a requirement of receiving funding, and being able to, put those hard lines in the sand is something that the government really can do, but not even just the government, also private actors like corporate buyers who are purchasing carbon removal right now, or investors who are investing in the early startups that are coming out into this field. All of these funders, philanthropic funders as well, like XPRIZE, have a role, and I would say a responsibility, but also an opportunity to say that this matters front and center in the beginning, and to ask companies to think about it, respond to it, and develop plans for it.
Now, the hubs that you mentioned, the direct air capture hubs, there's about $3.5 billion in the Inflation Reduction Act to support those programs. But as I listen to what you're saying, I think what we're describing is not the role that we think about when we think about the SEC that comes in and audits and is hard, but is more like the USDA farm agent who goes out and encourages and teaches and cajoles and demonstrates the benefits of making changes. Is that the right approach for government?
I think we need to see action on both sides here. I mean, there's a new proposed certification framework for carbon removal in Europe right now by the European Commission. That will be interesting to see how it unfolds. I mean, the regulatory bodies of kind of overseeing the carbon removal projects and what will become an industry is still very early. So I think we're maybe seeing more action right now on the funding side and the opportunity to influence and, enact change through proposals and RFPs that come out. And that is an early stage way that they can make an impact. Also, we see that, government procurement can have a significant role, like as these companies are expanding, and some of them are are making physical products through what they're doing as well, like storing carbon, CO2 in concrete. The government has a role to play with purchasing low CO2 concrete in all of the buildings that are being built and things like that. So there's a number of different levers that can be pulled here. And I think we need to see them all kind of working simultaneously.
Now, many of the jobs in the carbon removal industry might involve low-wage work, planting trees, tending kelp forests, and even maintaining some of this equipment is going to be relatively straightforward, simple work. How do we finance education and investments in human opportunity to ensure that locally impacted community members are part of management, scientific and technical teams, as well as just doing the easy work, so to speak? Not to diminish the quality of or the importance of the work either.
I think that's a great question. And I think, what we need to do is think beyond what carbon removal has looked like in terms of jobs, planting trees, and to think about its potential to create new high quality jobs. Mm-hmm. And part of what we're doing and advocating for is this thing called just transition. This should look like having jobs for skilled individuals, putting funding, allocating a lot of funding to train, to make sure that communities are actually getting the jobs in which the projects are being placed, and to make sure that these are high paying jobs. So we're not looking for part-time jobs where, you get paid minimum wage. We're looking to pretty much make sure that individuals are in a place to live off of carbon removal jobs.
Now, another area that I want to talk about is the trade-offs that go on between procedural justice, distributive justice, and reparative justice, as well as profit, since we're talking about an industry. Those trade-offs are always hard to negotiate in traditionally in this country, and this will happen with local economic incentive programs. They'll give a company a massive amount of tax incentives and credits, and they build a facility. This happened right near me with Intel. 3 years later, they're gone. How do you suggest that communities and companies negotiate when and how justice will be achieved?
Yeah, I can take a first stab at that. Alina, feel free to add on. I mean, I think that the different justice lenses that we kind of tackled in the report, I think they all have their own unique elements to bring here. And they're working best when they're all together. When you look at reparative justice, it's really coming to the table with an understanding of the past harms. And that's something that is really like the educational element for a lot of these startups, is how I've been thinking about it, being aware of, what the community has experienced in the past that you're going to be going into. That's not necessarily something that requires a ton of money. That requires, awareness and education and research for the team that's going to go in and manage this project. And then, when you're being transparent about the potential risks of the project and all of the distributive justice areas, I think that's really important for you to start thinking more holistically about your project and working potentially with other folks who might have some experience here. So one of the things we talked about a lot when we were working on the report was how does this play out in the life cycle of a project? So beginning to end. So a lot of teams we work with right now in the prize are really early stage, and they're just coming out of the lab. They're a small team, maybe under 10 people. They may not be in a place to have a full-time staff member that they can pay to do this work. That doesn't mean there's not a way to incorporate it. And so, trying to figure out how do you work with consultants who have experience in this space? How do you bring in advisors from the local community, because they are the experts on, everything that's going on in that space. And so starting maybe with a lighter touch approach that's not so financially burdensome for an early stage startup, that you can then grow over time as you go from your seed funding to your Series A and your Series B, and you start to get into a larger project. Now maybe you can think about like growing that team out or putting more resources behind it, because there definitely is a trade-off between what you put those early dollars into for any startup, but being able to at least approach the work with this lens in mind will transform, I believe, the way that companies kind of grow and scale and tackle the problem.
Elena, I'd love to hear what you think about that.
I definitely echo what Nikki just said. And I think, one of the things that we were trying to accomplish in this report was to offer guidance and set like actionable steps to help carbon removal companies think exactly like that. Think about when and how justice will be achieved and how their projects are doing at every stage of the individual justices. So this report is to essentially provide a vision for building this new industry from the ground up, and to think about, ways in which justice should be intertwined in carbon removal.
So instead of promising future benefits, someday we'll have a lot of jobs because you gave us all this incentive now, but building in these initial reparative benefits is the right way to think about structuring a company. And I do see a lot of sustainably oriented companies, not just in carbon capture, but sustainably oriented companies making these steps early on. Going back to the survey, how did you find the carbon capture companies perceive that obligation or that opportunity?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we saw a really wide range of responses to the survey itself. And some of the themes that came out when we were looking at all the different responses, we've hit on a couple of them today, but everything from job creation to community engagement to just understanding past harms. I think that what we saw, though, is that oftentimes the companies might equate environmental justice with one of those things specifically,
right,
not with all of them collectively. So really, it's an effort to kind of broaden the understanding. A lot of people just went straight to jobs creation because, that's an easy thing to wrap your mind around. It's also talked about pretty broadly, and the concept of the just transition is a familiar idea for a lot of people who work in the energy industry as well. And so I think they also see a very tangible benefit with that. They're like, oh, I'm going to bring jobs to this space, but it's not going as far as it needs to with the nuance and complexity that we've been talking about there, but also making sure that it's not just about jobs. It's about all of the other dimensions here. Elena, would you add to that?
Yeah, I would just add that, there's this willingness from all of them to want to do the best that they can do in terms of incorporating equity and justice into their project development. And like Nikki said, they were all aware that there are equity and justice concerns, but they don't know how to do it. And I think that's the next step, is how do we get them to do it right? And that only happens when you're getting community buy-in, when you're reading things like the report, and when you're working with organizations whose priority is on centering equity and justice in not only carbon removal, but in other technologies that are essentially going to combat the climate crisis.
Well, I'm struck by the fact that more diverse leadership teams are the ones who don't see just one of those benefits as sufficient. Instead, they say, we need a lot more. We need to be thinking more. But of course, corporate representation hasn't been very good until recently, and it's only starting to get better. The way that this is going to be playing out depends heavily on the transparency you described earlier. So are we approaching a time when, because of that need for transparency, these companies are going to have to operate in the open in order to be accountable, not just to the communities, but to their customers about their impacts and reporting all those things? Do you see that as where, not because we legislate it, but because it's the right thing to do? Is that where business is going?
I would hope so, because as we stated earlier, there are regulations in place that already mandate businesses to provide transparency. What this is doing is it's putting the ownership on the industry to say, I willingly want to do this because I'm committed to this work to be a part of equity and justice, to make sure that voices are being heard, to make sure that my industry or my business is doing the right thing for not only the climate crisis, but for your community.
There's another concept that we talk about too, related to this, around social license to operate. And that's another dimension here about, we're seeing communities having a stronger voice across all industries, but especially in this space around, wanting or not wanting projects to be in their area. And so there is a real business risk for companies who decide not to think about this in the early days, in addition to the moral imperative that we've been talking about. It's important for companies to build buy-in before they go into a new space, especially if their projects are going to be scaling to the level that some of them might. Building social license and acceptance over time will really help the success of their projects and mitigate that potential risk down the line too.
So I know this is a big question, but if the industry is successful in being just, what does the world in 2050 look like because of the presence of the carbon capture industry? For those of you listening, both of our guests are smiling and looking around thinking, I love this question.
Ideally, in a perfect world, we would reach gigaton scale, and carbon removal would be the example for all other new technologies on how to do things the right way. And I think that's what we want to get to. We want carbon removal to be that shining star for how to make sure that we have equity and justice intertwined in in project development, and that communities are thriving.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I would just add, I agree with that vision. I think, our hope is that the industry itself is really integrated in local communities and all the different places where the projects are based. And it's not an extractive relationship, that there is real community benefit coming to all the places where the projects live. And it's not an afterthought. It's not something that we're talking about after the industry has been built. It was from day one, a dialogue. And so if it can become that, it really will be an example for other industries moving forward.
It'll be great to see growing and thriving communities coexisting with that industry. And I really thank you very much for spending time with us today. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We've been speaking with Elena Chunny, Managing Advisor at Carbon 180, and Nikki Batchelor, Director of the $100 million XPRIZE Carbon Removal Program. You can learn more about Carbon 180 at carbon180.org. All one word, Carbon 180, no space, no dash, carbon180.org. And about the XPRIZE at xprize.org. In our work at Earth911, we talk to a lot of startups, many of whom are taking intentional steps to be sustainable and equitable from the outset. Over the course of history, many industries have appeared and self-organized, often based on the values and interests of a very small group of leaders, the innovators who initially introduced the technology or the process that changed the industry. But designing a future by thinking ahead about the long-term consequences of our decisions, looking beyond short-term profits to see the holistic impact of a company on its communities and nature, is a novel opportunity, one that emerged from our improved ability to model possibilities and test our decisions in advance. But companies also run out of money, and that can limit the most forward-thinking teams. In the 20th century, companies tended to make promises of future benefits to communities where they were going to build a factory, jobs in the future, tax revenues in the future, and so forth. Today, values-driven customers often put their support behind companies based on their commitment to environmental, social, and reporting responsibilities. And companies must deliver on those promises with transparent reporting and ongoing engagement with representatives of the communities and nature. A lot of this is basically a different form of marketing and public relations. The social license to operate, as Nikki said, is evolving. It comes with challenges and represents an exciting opportunity to transform society if we do it right. And of course, that's what we're going to continue to watch as the carbon capture industry evolves. I hope you'll take a few minutes to share this podcast or any of the more than 390 interviews we've done on sustainability in your ear. If you take a moment to write a review of our podcast on your favorite site, it would really help your neighbors find us. You folks are the amplifiers that spread more ideas to create less waste. Please tell your friends, family, and coworkers they can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Audible, or any of the other fine purveyors of podcast goodness. Thank you so much, folks, for your support. I'm Mitch Ratcliffe. This is Earth911. We'll be back with another innovator interview soon. In the meantime, folks, take care of yourself, take care of one another, and let's all take care of this beautiful planet of ours. Have a green day.